I'm Andrew Cheyne, SNAP Deputy Director for the Food Research and Action Center. I'm so glad to be joined today by Vicky Negus, Policy Advocate at the Massachusetts Law Reform Institute. Last month, the United States Department of Agriculture, or the USDA, announced an impactful new policy to improve equitable access to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, may have a different name in your state, formerly known as food stamps, by including discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity in the prohibition against sex discrimination under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We are going to be discussing the implications of this policy and what else can be done to provide more equitable SNAP access to the LGBTQIA+ community today. First, just a little bit of information to level set. I think we in the anti-hunger community are increasingly and intentionally centering equity in our work. But within these conversations, however, too often we overlook disparate rates of food insecurity, inequitable access to federal nutrition programs like SNAP, or related issues for members of the LGBTQ+ community. So the Census Household Pulse survey has thankfully been tracking some of these issues, and I encourage everyone to look at those rates. You can often bring those down to your state or community level. But I want to put a highlight on what the UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles Law School Williams Institute recently published. They found that amongst transgender people, the rates of food insecurity reported are almost 2.5 times that of cisgender people. And that gulf goes up to nearly 5 times the rate for trans people of color compared to cisgendered white people. So I think we really need to sit with that, and we'll be digging in today to why some of that is. Specifically regarding SNAP, fewer transgender people who met SNAP's income guidelines report being enrolled by 10 percentage points. So we know that there are issues underlying that. And again, I'm excited to dig in to Vicky, with Vicky around what this policy means and what else needs to be done to address these issues. So Vicky, first, just to make sure we all understand what this announcement from USDA is, and we're on the same page. Can you please describe the recent policy announcement by the USDA? What does it mean to add gender identity and sexual orientation to the USDA's prohibition on sex discrimination?
Yeah, absolutely. And Andrew, thank you for having me. And as always, we love partnering with FRAC on these types of conversations. So just really glad to be able to have this conversation today. I think that the recent policy announcement from USDA around adding gender identity and sexual orientation to the sort of list of prohibition on discrimination is really a critical and long overdue update and clarification to states and partners and communities. And it requires states and agencies, all the agencies that administer the federal nutrition programs like SNAP, and others that receive funds from USDA, from the Food and Nutrition Service, to investigate allegations of discrimination based on gender identity or sexual orientation. It also requires states, sort of in this initial directive to states, to update their non-discrimination policies and their sort of public-facing messaging, signage, et cetera, to include that language about the anti-discrimination protections based on gender identity and sexual orientation. So that is the 101 of what it does. And we're really thrilled about that for a number of reasons. First, it sort of sets up this legal infrastructure and framework that states have to follow to ensure that the LGBTQ community isn't discriminated against, and that folks, individuals and families, if they feel like they face discrimination, they can come forward and have a more clear inroads and pathway to communicate those concerns and file those civil rights complaints and allegations of discrimination. So that is sort of, in our view, the first big piece of this guidance and why we think it is so critical. The second piece of it is that it is a very clear message to states, to families, to communities, to participants in these federal nutrition programs, that SNAP and WIC and all the USDA programs and the federal government are here for families who are struggling with food insecurity, regardless of what those families look like, where they live, and who they love and who they spend time with. So I think that is a really, the messaging, in addition to the reality of what this means, is really in our view, valuable and a big step forward for sure.
Thank you. I really appreciate all of that information, level setting, and really hearing about some of the implications. I'm wondering if you can provide maybe some context from either the existing prohibition on sex discrimination or other types of civil rights protections regarding, race or other ways in which there have been existing protections on the books, and what people might expect now that this has been added for sexual orientation and gender identity.
Yeah, I mean, it's a wide-ranging question. I think one of the first things that we often talk about when we are, doing trainings on SNAP or talking with families, there's this huge, robust set of legal protections and core rights that folks have when they are applying for this benefit or they're receiving SNAP, for example. And that's a really important legal infrastructure, right, to make sure that folks have a right to get the benefit they're eligible for. And it also means that it's empowering for people to understand that and hear that message loud and clear from the state that they live in, because it can help reduce some of the concern around discrimination, stigma, uncertainty, lack of dignity when interacting with government agencies. So I think that, as part of this package of anti-discrimination rules and policies that trickle down from the federal government into the ways that states administer these programs is really important, because it sort of fills some of the gaps in what that communication has been like. And that goes all the way from like signage in local offices and language on applications and the fine print that says, we can't discriminate for all these reasons, making sure there are no gaps in that language, because folks see that and they absorb it and they can see their own realities better reflected in that language with this change, which is critical. So it's all the way from sort of the language that is used and the forms that are sent out and the communication and messaging that goes out to communities, all the way through what actually happens during the eligibility determination process, right? When someone walks in the front door, whether literally or figuratively, to apply for this benefit that they're eligible for, what is that experience like for them? And not only are the laws followed, but do they feel like that experience is dignified, respectful, and equitable? And this communication from USDA, I think, just adds to the levels of what states need to do to make sure that that's the case.
I thank you. Yeah, and we'll come back to that kind of messaging and stigma. I don't think that can be overstated. But thank you for laying out, some of the implications, and just following up on that. Can you help us think through? So, in a situation where someone does feel that they've been discriminated against or treated in an undignified way, and want to express those rights, what are some of the options available to SNAP customers or customers of other federal nutrition programs? Like you pointed out, this applies to all of the federal nutrition services. It's not just SNAP.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, the first, again, because this is a program that for SNAP, for example, and the other federal nutrition programs, these are federal programs that are administered by states. So I think the first step, and we tell folks who come to us with these questions, this advice is to reach out to the regional food and nutrition services office. Every single region in the country has a specific staff or multiple staff that work on the civil rights division in that region. And so on the FNS website, there's a phone number and contact information for the civil rights office or the civil rights officer in every single region. And those folks, their job is to hear these concerns and then take the appropriate next steps, to whether it be an action or just a response and receipt of the information, whatever the thing is that needs to get done, that's their job to do it. So that, I think, is the first piece, is going to FNS. But I also think it's important to recognize sort of what we're asking folks to do, right? And asking folks to waive their vulnerable story around for the federal government is not necessarily a good solution for a lot of people. And so, as a legal services organization, Mass Law Reform is the statewide poverty law center in Massachusetts. It is really critical to make sure that community organizations, legal services, legal aid programs across the state, that folks have an inroads to those places as well, so that they can raise up anything that they feel like was discriminatory in their experience with the state agency, and that they can do that in a way that feels more equitable and comfortable and safe for them. And so, I think part A would be go to FNS, and part B would be go to your local legal aid office and share what happened and see how they can support taking next steps. The other piece of this, or to file a complaint directly with the state agency, but sometimes again, if the state agency is the one who discriminated against you, that can feel not like the best solution for folks. And I think the other piece that, we often have this conversation with people is that having an experience that is frankly traumatic, right? Being discriminated against when you're trying to apply for or continue to get the federal benefits you're eligible for can be really traumatic for people. That experience, sharing that story with folks who can help leverage it to make changes can be really empowering for that person. But the bottom line is it's their choice to evaluate if they want to do that or not. And so I think laying out the options, laying out the places that folks can go, and making sure that there are meaningful connection points there is really critical.
Thank you. So just picking up on that piece you mentioned about, trauma informed, I think that there are some things that are potentially specific to this policy action, but that touch on broader issues that you just mentioned, related to potentially other forms of discrimination or just a dignified experience for all the customers accessing the federal nutrition programs. So I'll leave it a little up to you, but what are some success stories or lessons learned to share about making SNAP access more equitable for the LGBTQ plus community, whether it's specific or again, whether it's broader and cross-cutting that helps ensure equitable access for everyone?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I think for the queer community, one place that we often, or I personally, we start with is with our language. So whether that be working with the state SNAP agency to work on inclusive language that relates to gender identity, explaining, for example, in the SNAP application, instead of just asking, what is your gender, male, female, which is extraordinarily exclusionary for a lot of members of the queer community. Instead saying, what was your sex assigned at birth, explaining why a government agency is asking for that, again, increasing dignity, and changing language to allow folks to express, if they wish, what their gender identity is directly to the state. And again, explaining why that information is being asked for so that it feels less vulnerable for folks because they understand what, like the meaning of and the value of communicating that information to a government agency. And I think that desire to have more inclusive language used within government, it translates certainly to what the anti-hunger community and our community partners are saying as well. For example, we strive when we're talking about WIC, when we're talking about cash assistance for families, instead of talking about pregnant women, we try hard to talk about pregnant people or use other language that is more inclusive than these blanket statements that leave a whole swath of folks out, and receiving that more inclusive language can bring people forward to apply for the programs they're eligible for. So I think that's like one sliver of the actions that we've tried hard to work on here, and I think are useful in a whole variety of settings and a whole variety of changes.
And I'm just building off that. I'm wondering what you think about, training as well, whether it's for SNAP eligibility workers or eligibility workers in, WIC and other programs, or even the community partners. One thing you brought up earlier, and I think is an important thread, is that this policy is not just for states, but it's also for community partners, whether those are our food banks who are providing federal commodities, or SNAP outreach, application assistance, who are using a federal contract. I'm just curious if you had any experience or any recommendations you have to make sure that there's effective training on this new policy, and just on the language and dignity issues that you've brought up more generally.
Yeah, I think everything you just said, Andrew. I mean, I think part of it is sort of just institutionalizing it in whatever the training procedures that the state agencies have, or SNAP outreach partners, community groups, food banks, the Emergency Food Network, really just embedding in all of those conversations, a real equity lens, a racial equity lens, recognition about the LGBTQIA plus community, how those two things intersect, right? We know that the LGBTQ community of color faces significantly higher rates of homelessness and poverty than the white members of the queer community. So it's all very nuanced, but I think really centering like honesty and thoughtfulness about those conversations as much as possible, and institutionalizing it in the processes that are set up in all of those different places is for sure a big next step out of this really important statement from USDA that I think level sets all of us to figure out how we embed that in the work that we're doing.
Yeah, with someone who's transitioning in my own family, I appreciate the nuance and how individual it can be and how it's embedded in all of these larger structures of privilege and marginalization and oppression.
Yeah.
And that is a great segue to what I was going to ask, which is really, we started with some of those disparities and some of those intersections. And I wanted to come back to that lens. And we've mentioned the data, and you just mentioned that Black, Latinx, Native, other, queer communities of color experience far higher rates of hunger, of oppression, of marginalization. But one of those is the disproportionate burdens of rent and other costs of basic needs and cost of living. And I'm curious what you think about how, this policy may be related to others that can be leveraged to improve equitable access to SNAP and try and reduce some of those inequities.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we all know SNAP and food insecurity exists within a broader framework of poverty and challenges that families are facing. And I think that reality is an important one to keep in mind, right? So we know, for example, homeless teens, queer youth face homelessness rates at a much higher rate, and higher shelter costs, face greater barriers to consistent work. And the realities for what this means for a lot of members of the queer community, especially folks and people of color, BIPOC members of the queer community, the way I think we have a real task at hand to address some of the long-standing policies within SNAP, within some of the other programs, but speaking to SNAP in particular, making sure that the program is more equitable and reflects the realities of the world for LGBTQ families, youth, individuals. There's a few places that come to mind. Certainly making sure that the real impact of higher shelter costs are reflected in the benefit amount, making sure that the monthly SNAP dollars that go into the account for low-income families actually meaningfully meets the needs for that family for the full month. And also looking at some of the most problematic parts of SNAP, for example, the 3-month time limit, recognizing that time limit disproportionately harms LGBTQ youth and young adults who struggle to access consistent employment at higher rates. And, recognizing that the program in a lot of ways doesn't support, for example, homeless queer youth who may have to leave home, may not have access to or healthy relationships with family that they may have been connected to in the past, and making sure that this program reflects that reality and supports younger adults and queer youth in a way that is more supportive and more meaningful. And I think there's a lot of sort of ways that we need to peel back how this program works and then fix the problems that disproportionately harm LGBTQ members of our states and of our country, and certainly, recognize the way that would impact food insecurity rates and poverty for our queer community across the country, for sure.
Well, I can't put it better than that. Thank you, Vicky, for sharing your time, your expertise, and some of the great work that I know you're pushing in Massachusetts, driving those policy solutions, some of the administrative work to try and make the language, the experience as inclusive and as dignified as possible. I just wanted to say that folks can find more information at FRAC's website. We've put up a blog on the USDA policy and some of the initial implications. As Vicky said, the action is largely going to turn to the states to implement, but we do expect the USDA to come out with additional guidance. And so we encourage folks to be in touch, to be checking either the FNS website, or certainly FRAC intends to continue to publish on this. as well as the legislation. Thankfully, there's legislation in Congress that would address some of the issues that Vicky raised. We're certainly always looking for new good ideas to address challenges and make the program more equitable. But I encourage you to go to FRAC's Legislative Action Center, look at the bills we're supporting on SNAP, and encourage your members of Congress to sponsor the solutions we know will help make the benefit more adequate, help make the program more accessible and equitable, and really start to take on some of these challenges head on. So we're grateful for the USDA's action. There's more to be done, and we appreciate everyone's time and energy on this critical issue. Thank you.